All right, guys, our favorite time of the week again when we get to answer a few of your questions. Saagar, what's up first?
Number one, Jamian Fisher, Republican stance on rate hikes. For the most part, it seems Republicans have been silent regarding interest rate hikes, as it's surely helping their chances in the midterms. Obviously, we're filming this before the midterms. Assuming they win one or both chambers, do you think they will begin a message against further rate hikes? This would give them the ability to claim a victory if the hike stops or lessen at a minimum, put them on the, quote, right side of the debate.
Mixed on this one because I think there's an ideological component, and I also think like part of the desire to have the Fed hike rates is to discipline labor, which has been, you know, getting a little bit uppity with their strikes and their unionizing and their quiet quitting and their relocations and their resignations and all that stuff. So I am inclined to think that they'll continue to back the same policy as the Biden administration of like pushing for more rate hikes to crush the labor market and crush wages. But you know, Trump was different on this. He was cheering for the Fed to keep rates low. I mean, the other piece is that like it'll be divided government. So they won't get to really take total credit.
And Jerome has already been renominated for another term.
Right.
Which is 7 years.
It's not like if lowering the rates, if they stop hiking rates or they lower rates and that improves the economy, it's not like Republicans will really get total credit. Biden could claim, this is me, I'm president, and people usually put the credit or the blame with the president. So I don't know. I don't think they'll change course.
I don't think they will necessarily. I also don't think it matters at all. I think it also, here's the other thing. They could just get credit for a better economy because less rate hikes will come in 2023 whenever they're around in 2024.
That's what they're signaling anyway.
Well, why wouldn't you take credit? I mean, it's a time-honored tradition. So I don't think they have to even take a position necessarily, even though they can still benefit from lack of rate hikes. They don't have to take a position, period, because it's already been baked in.
Yeah, I don't hear any of these politicians really talking about it at all, which is how they really like it. They like to pretend like, you know, it's all hands off and the Fed's just completely independent, even though we know that's not really totally true.
Yep.
Cool. Next question, Brent Lemire, corporate profit motive alternative. Krystal constantly points to profit motive as being the source of big business evil. True, but I have not heard a valid alternative. Companies like Pfizer, Google, Apple, or ExxonMobil are so big and transnational they transcend the laws of any one nation. What do you think could be a replacement for profit that would motivate these companies to exist and take into account the well-being of their workers and customers? I mean, listen, there are certain sectors that I just think should be nationalized or more closely nationalized. So things like, you know, Twitter and the public square, I think should be regulated like public utilities. I think that healthcare should be much more governed by, you know, the federal government, because when you have a profit motive at the center, it's just an utter disaster. But in most sectors of the economy, I think you need a balance. You need, you know, corporations, it's fine to have a profit motive. They have to be checked, though, by an empowered workforce, labor, that's the labor movement, labor unions having a say in the workings of that business and pushing for their fair piece of the pie, of the, you know, the profit pie. And you also have to have an active government that isn't just completely captured by corporate America and doing their bidding and looking for their own next job in terms of, you know, going to these corporations. So if you had a government that, you know, wasn't captured, that was independent, that had its own goals and ideals in mind as to what that sector should be accomplishing, if you had a workforce that was empowered and that was organized through the labor movement, and then you have the corporations with their own sense of power, if you have those three forces in balance, you're going to get a wildly better situation than what we have right now, where it's just the corporate profits, the government's captured, and workers are completely crushed.
Yeah, I just think it's about balance. Exactly, right. It's like, do you think that Amazon should rule the day-to-day lives of 1.5 million people who work for them? I think the answer is no. We've always recognized that for over 100 years, that you're going to have some say of government regulation. It's all just a question of degrees. You know, these are all things that, it's interesting. I'm reading a book about the Vanderbilts right now and about the level of like government interference in railroads and all that. It took a long time to establish a lot of these norms, which we all basically just take for granted in our current system. We don't have unfettered free market capitalism. We rejected that wholesale out through the Gilded Age and instituted a lot of different reforms. I also would say, in regards to all of those corporations, all of them have a significant portion of business here, which would actually require them to behave basically in the same way abroad, just because the norms that they would set in a U.S. market would just carry over to everywhere else.
Yeah, we're still a big fish. You know, we still have a lot of power.
The biggest fish.
Yeah.
Like, they're not just the big fish.
All right, next question.
Alex Pavlok. Big D or R politics versus small d or R. Love the show. I've been following since the days of Rising. Can you explain what you mean about big letter politics versus small letter politics? It's kind of something I made up, to be honest, but I don't think it's that difficult to understand, which is that when I say capital P, I mean amongst capital P politics, that's like people who work in the political industry. Think of it as a game, disproportionately more likely to be inside the system. Small p is what motivates you who doesn't necessarily pay attention to the news or even work in politics. Why do you actually vote? And I think about small d and capital D, all that.
Okay, so I was thinking of it in terms of
do they mean small d democracy?
small
capital
d,
democracy.
right? So small d is like actual democracy, not to be confused with like democratic norms, not to be confused with the capital D Democratic Party, which gets the capital D just because it's like a proper name.
That's smart. Okay.
That's what I was. That's what I was thinking. There isn't a. I guess there is an equivalent on the Republican side, although it's not used as often because you could think about like the Republic versus the Republican Party. But usually people say like small d democracy, democratic norms or standards, or that sort of democracy versus the capital D Democratic Party is how I was thinking.
Oh, I misread it. Yeah, you're totally right. That's exactly what they're asking. My bad. Yeah, it's just small d democracy versus capital D democracy. I would say capital D democracy is like when MSNBC is like, our democracy. That's what they mean, capital D democracy. All right, next one.
Brandon Stinson, Chinese lockdowns, why such a strict policy? Hi, would either of you know anything about why China's lockdowns are still so strict at this point? I understand why a policy might be so strict prior to information, vaccines, and treatments. Why the continued extreme lockdowns years later? Saagar, you've done a lot of looking into this.
It's actually very simple. It's very dystopian. It has nothing to do with COVID. They like controlling the population, and they like the ability to control them to the fullest extent possible. They've got QR codes. They got it all over everybody's phones. They can lock people in their houses. They got cameras to make sure that you're scanning your QR code. It's the best thing they could ever ask for, to institute even more of a surveillance state.
Like we have a surveillance state.
Yeah.
Theirs is like way
10,000 times
more ramped up than ours. Yeah. I mean, they also did kind of screw themselves though, because they had the COVID zero policy. They didn't get their old people vaccinated to nearly the extent that we did. So then it does present a like real, genuine health risk to them as well. But no, I mean, the dude who ran the most stringent lockdowns in Shanghai, he was just elevated to premier of the party.
He not just elevated, he was given a gift essentially as like a good job for doing that.
Right. So even though it was insanely unpopular, draconian, dystopian, all of that stuff, they're like, you did it right. We like that. That's exactly what we wanted. So I think it has to do with, I also think, you tell me what you think of this, Saagar. I also think there's an element of, the idea with China's handling of COVID was basically to serve as a model to the world of like how effective our governance is, and another demonstration project of basically like your democracies don't function, are totally dysfunctional, doesn't work for your population at all. So it's also a sort of demonstration project of what they're capable of logistically.
Yeah, very, very accurate. And that's a good insight, which is that what they want to show the world is they have an alternative to the Western model, which is essentially, quote, giving up. But I think that's fine. I actually think it's the most reasonable explanation in a free society, but they don't want a free society. They have totally different norms. It's a projection of power, and it's also a projection to the world. They're like, no, we take it in a very different approach. So in the long run, it will hurt their economy, but they've shown they're like, we just don't care. Interesting article in the New York Times this morning. A lot of Chinese business elite are like, yeah, the Xi Jinping government has no time for us. They don't care about us at all. All they care about is control at the highest levels of government. If anything, they see big business oligarchs as a threat to their own power.
Yeah, I mean, there's this is the most dystopian, like obviously, like clearly authoritarian negative side of that. There are parts of the Chinese approach, though, that are things that we could frankly learn from, where, I was asked earlier about like the profit motive. They have values that are outside of just let's maximize profits for the corporations that are based here that we're buddies with or whatever. I mean, they had continue to have very strategic industrial policy. There's, values of making sure that it's not just total like oligarchy the way that we have here. So, but yeah, the lockdowns and the authoritarianism and the surveillance state, obviously terrible, disaster.
Yep.
Unconscionable. All right, last one. Sherry Morrill, why was Trump so scary? What do you think was so scary about Trump that made the powers that be make up elaborate stories to hurt him, try to cover up real stories that would hurt his opponents? What do you think, Saagar?
I think Trump is very offensive to a certain type of individual who, look, I mean, I said this in one of my monologues. I was like, look, you either think the man came out of nowhere or you're like, wow, that's pretty crazy. There's some real stuff must have gone wrong in order to make that happen.
Right.
I think that if you're predisposed to thinking it came out of nowhere, that is really scary. I mean, by and large, if the system works for you, somebody like Trump is like very vulgar. The people who support him, in spite of many of the norms violations, like you like norms work for your life. These are things that you probably learned in educational institutions. This is everything that you've learned. It's not supposed to be possible. And a great big D democracy for all of this. And Trump is just a living embodiment that actually none of that, or some of it is true, but a lot of it is being challenged. And so, yeah, I think that's why it's really scary. Whereas if you take the alternative approach, we're like, wow, this is a symptom of something very, very deep. It's very multifaceted. Then it's not so much scary as a logical conclusion. And it leads you one to say, well, if things got this bad, you can do something about it. That's the other thing. People think that you can just solve everything by getting rid of Trump. What have the last 2 years taught us?
Right.
Not possible.
Right.
So
yeah. I think it's a couple of things. It's actually a very interesting question to ponder. I mean, I think one is just if you're someone that like the current situation is working well for you, you don't want chaos. You don't want uncertainty. You just want things to more or less continue in the same direction, maybe with some incremental improvements, but you're good. And so even though ultimately, he gives the tax cuts, he did a lot of the sort of standard issue Republican presidential shit. The fact that he's so volatile and you just don't know, you don't have that level of certainty, you don't have an in to him, you're not an insider with him, you don't really understand how his mind works, you don't know what's going to happen. I think there's that piece. And then I also think in terms of our political elites, to me, for them, the more comforting explanation is he came out of nowhere.
Yes, they love that.
Because they love that explanation, because that doesn't mean they don't have to do then any self-reflection of like, well, this is the system, the political system we created. We crafted the system. We set up all of the rules and dynamics of it. And so if he didn't just come out of nowhere, what did we do? How were we complicit in creating this like American monster? And so it's very discomforting that way as well, because it begs a lot of questions about the powers that be. And then the introduction of the chaos and the uncertainty. Of course, the irony is that people who like rented their garments the most about Trump were also the ones that got the richest and the most famous over the whole thing. So it ended up being a very symbiotic ecosystem that they're all desperate to get back to. At this point, they're not afraid of him. They'd love to have him back because it was great for their like ratings and book sales and whatever.
Yeah, very smart.
All right. Love you guys. We'll see you soon.